opened your eyes to the damp scent of clay, mingled with the faint smoke from the embers still glowing beneath the workbench. The coarse fabric of your kimono scratched the tired skin when it draped across your shoulders, and your calloused hands rested heavily on the worn wooden table, its surface chipped and scattered with shards of ceramic and rusted tools. Outside, a cold wind whispered through the cracked tiles of the roof you had shaped with your own hands, each shingle carrying the silent weight of expectations and unspoken vows. The village lay quiet under a gray sky, the heavy clouds casting muted shadows that blended seamlessly with the earth's dull browns and grays. Your place in this world, humble yet crucial, was in the making of these ceramic roofs, a craft as ancient and slow as the seasons themselves. Each tile was more than clay. It was a piece of your honor, shaped by labor, baked by fire, and set against the relentless mood of feudal Japan's unforgiving dawn. You ran your fingers over the rough edge of a cooling tile, feeling its chilled surface beneath your skin. The crackle of the dying fire reached your ears, accompanied by the faint murmur of footsteps on stone outside your workshop, soft, measured, and hesitant. The scent of wet earth and burning wood wove through the air, filling your lungs with sharp and familiar comfort. This routine had been your life. The preparation of the clay, the slow shaping of each tile, the patient wait as the kiln devoured the hours, in a ritual as unforgiving as the silence following dishonor. Your craft demanded time, endless cycles of shaping and waiting that felt like watching shadows grow and fade on walls that never changed. If today's impatient souls grumbled over slow Wi-Fi signals or flashing screens, imagine your obsession with the kiln's reluctant heat, the unforgiving slowness that meant the difference between value and ruin. Time was your enemy, your accomplice, your judge. The steady rhythm of your work pulled you deeper into the familiar trance. The squeezes of wet clay between your fingers, the cold press of the tile mold, the shifted heat from the oven's edge. A faint glow from the embers promised life, a flicker of hope in the otherwise muted morning. Somewhere distant, children's laughter rose, then fell, slipping through narrow alleys like scattered leaves. For a brief moment, the weight on your chest felt lighter, as if the world outside remembered innocence despite your broken name. Then a hush settled over the village, abrupt and fragile, like a breath held too long. Through the half-open door, you caught the sidelong glance of a neighbor, his eyes brimming with cautious sorrow and an unspoken accusation. Their gaze pierced your resolve and let fall a quiet shadow, heavier than any roof you had ever built. Whispers, barely audible, floated like swallows in autumn, carrying secrets that threatened to crack your fragile redemption. And so, beneath the fading smoke and weathered tiles, Your journey began, not just one of clay and fire, but of silence, shadow, and a long road back from dishonor. Hey, before Morpheus takes you under completely, check real quick if you're still subscribed. For some, the button disappeared, and I don't want you to miss the next sleepy stories. Also, leave a soft like a pillow's touch. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Your interaction keeps this little corner of calm alive. Thanks for being part of it. You rose slowly from the worn wooden table, your limbs heavy as if weighted with the earth itself. The faint glow from the dying embers still lingered, casting elongated shadows across the scattered tools and cracked ceramics. A muted reminder of the fire's once roaring defiance. The air clung damply to your skin, cool and persistent, whispering secrets from the cold wind that tiptoed across the cracked tiles overhead. You stretched your fingers, feeling the stiffness in your joints, each movement deliberate and measured, as if you feared to wake something hidden in the silence. Outside, the village remained, wrapped in that heavy, troubled quiet, the kind that presses against the ribs and mutters of delicate balances soon to fray. You stepped to the doorway, the rough wood cold beneath your palm. The air was dense, carrying the scent of wet earth and smoldering ash, mingling uneasily with the faint trace of smoke that wound through the alleys. Your sharp breath formed small clouds as you exhaled, dissipating softly into the morning gloom. The sky overhead was an unbroken sheet of steel gray, a vault that seemed to press down as much and shelter. You lingered, eyes tracing the line of the rooftops, each tile a witness to the slow, deliberate hands that forged them. Your hands. Yet beneath the craftsmanship lay the weight heavier than clay. The quiet suspicion in the neighbor's glance, the whispered rumors that clung to the air like humid fog. Your name, fractured and fragile, carried on the wind even as you molded new tiles, hoping to solidify what had cracked irreparably. The past was a shadow that flickered beneath your purpose, its length stretching unyielding behind every breath. Turning back inside, you settled once more at the bench, fingers tracing the edges of a half-finished tile. The clay was cold, unyielding in your grip. Beneath its weight, you felt both the promise and the threat. The precise motion of your hands felt like an anchor to steadiness. The squeeze, the press, the swirl of moisture and earth blending in the humbling dance of creation. Time passed imperceptibly here. Hours folded into each other, moments stretched thin, flowing with the rhythm of weathered hands shaping stubborn clay. A soft noise reached you then, the barely audible shifting of footsteps on stone. They stalled, hesitant, the sound fragile as dry leaves skittering on stone. You held your breath, every sense sharpening as the faint shuffle moved closer to the workshop's door. The light flickered uncertainly, shadows pooling thickly in the corners. You did not look up, not yet. Instead, you focused on the slow glide of your fingers, coaxing shape from matter as if the act itself could ward off the heavy weight pressing against your chest. The door creaked, an echo barely louder than a sigh, and then the figure appeared, framed by the weak light outside. You recognized the neighbor, his eyes clouded with the same cautious sorrow and unsaid accusations from before. His gaze did not waver as he stepped inside, the faint scent of damp clothes and smoke clinging to him like a reluctant veil. You met his eyes in silence, the room thick with all the things left unspoken, the space between you a fragile thread pulled taut with history and pain. He shifted awkwardly, glancing past you toward the kiln's edge, the faint, persistent glow promising warmth and endurance. You felt the thrum of old fears pulse through your veins, the unrelenting scrutiny heavier than the bricks that sealed this space. He spoke no words, but the weight in his expression pressed down, a silent challenge that sparked tension in the still air. For a moment, you wondered if the fragile truce would hold, or if something long buried was about to crack the fragile peace you had built between breaths. Outside, the wind rustled against the wooden beams, carrying the distant, faint laughter of children echoing through the alleys once more, soft and fleeting as a memory. That gentle sound struck a chord deep within you, a momentary pause in the tight coil of suspicion and regret that had drawn so many walls around you. For an instant, the cold was less biting, the shadows less suffocating, as if the world remembered the innocence you longed to reclaim. The neighbor's gaze softened, ever so slightly, and he stepped forward, reaching out with hesitant fingers to touch the rough surface of a ceramic tile. Resting on your bench, his touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if seeking a trace of the honor lost in his silent judgment. You watched the faint tremor in his hand and the slow breath he drew, a quiet acknowledgement that the past was neither easily shed nor forgotten. Moved by a sudden resolve, you bent to the kiln, tracing the outline of the glowing embers through the ash with slow, deliberate movements. The warmth seeped into your chilled fingers, a faint heartbeat beneath the ancient stones. It was a reminder. The fire could consume, but it could also forge anew. You whispered nothing, but inside the silent ritual felt like an oath, a vow to carry on despite the fractures and shadows. The neighbor lingered a moment longer, then nodded, a slender gesture of truce mingled with resignation, and turned toward the shadows beyond the threshold. As his footsteps faded into the hush of the village, the weight in the room shifted, leaving behind a silence dense with unspoken possibilities. You remained by the kiln, the glow softening as the embers faded into quiet ash, the inevitable coolness reclaiming the space. Your eyes rested on the scattered shards and the cracked roof beyond, each tile a promise and a question unanswered. From some distant corner of the village, a bell tolled once, low and sonorous, sinking into the fog like a secret waiting to be uncovered. You felt it, an unyielding pull beneath the surface of calm, the whisper of something yet to come. And then, beneath the fragile veil of dawn, you sensed a presence watching from the edges of the silence, unseen, patient, waiting for the moment you might falter. You lingered by the kiln, the embers waning into soft ash beneath your fingertips, the faint warmth, retreating like a memory fading at dawn. Outside, the village held its breath, wrapped in gray silence that pressed gently but firmly, like the weight of clouds gathering low and slow. The brittle crackle of cooling clay shards under your palm was a fragile counterpoint to the distant, muted tolling of a bell, its low, sonorous tone curling through the damp air and sinking deep, as if carrying a message wrapped in shadow. You stepped back from the fire's remains, the muscles along your spine reluctant to release the tension they'd held through the night. The coolness creeping from the stone floor matched the chill threading your limbs, and your breath came in quiet puffs, scattering softly like pale mist. Your eyes drifted upward, catching the shrouded outlines of rooftops, each tile a silent witness to hours of patient labor, and each shadow a slow secret gathering in the cracks of the village's skin. The faint trace of smoke still hung in the air, entwined with the earth's dampness and the crisp bite of morning's slow arrival. You moved toward the door, every step deliberate, your feet brushing against stones slick with dew and moss. The cold bit at your ankles, a whispered reminder that the world beyond your workshop was restless, waiting. The stubborn wind coiled through the narrow alleys, threading between half-forgotten walls and broken roof tiles, carrying with it a scent that was both ancient and new, a promise you could almost reach out and grasp. You paused on the threshold, your gaze drifting to a narrow street, disappearing into a haze of mist. The villagers' houses stood silent, their windows dull-faced and watching, like tired eyes in the early gloom. Somewhere a wooden shutter creaked, a slow, reluctant sound that scattered like dry leaves. The quiet was thick, but vibrant in its tension, as if every breath and footstep might ripple an unseen thread stretched taut across the village. Turning back inside, you allowed your fingers to trace the gritty edges of a tile laid out on the bench, its surface cool and uneven beneath your skin. Clay and dust mingled lightly with the smell of smoldering ash and faded incense. The dull weight of the tile grounded you, solid, stubborn, unchanging. You pressed it gently, feeling the minute give beneath your touch, the faint crumb of grit that demanded respect and patience. A sudden shift drew your attention to the corner of the room, where shadows gathered thickest. The place where the light's slow retreat carved out hollow pockets. You listened, the faintest scrape of stone fingernails against stone breaking the stillness. Your breath stilled as a figure emerged from the half-light, moving. With cautious steps that seemed equal parts invitation and caution, The air between you tightened, charged with unspoken words, gathering like fog. His eyes searched yours with a blend of regret and guarded hope, fingers brushing tentatively across a shelf where broken tiles sat stacked in silent rows. The faint twitch of his jaw spoke volumes of mistrust, but also of a need to bridge the narrowing gap that history had cracked open. You met his gaze steadily, your own eyes heavy with the quiet resolve born from countless cycles of shaping and waiting. The moment stretched, two lives suspended in fragile balance, before he finally broke the silence with a subtle nod, imperceptible yet profound. Outside, the soft clatter of footsteps faded slowly into the distant chorus of birdsong, struggling through the morning mist, an ephemeral lullaby in a world reluctant to awaken. You returned your focus to the kiln, now empty, but still whispering traces of its ancient heat. Your hands moved with ritualistic care, brushing ash from the cracked stones, tracing the delicate scars left by fire and time. The room grew warmer with each slow breath, the lingering heat merging with your own steady rhythm, a muted heartbeat echoing the slow passage of seasons. Through the single latticed window, the sky lightened gradually, streaks of pale blue bleeding through the iron-gray expanse. A solitary leaf drifted lazily on a reluctant breeze, its edges curled and faded, a quiet testament to endurance amid inevitable decay. You watched it fall, caught by a whisper of wind, tracing its slow spiral with your eyes as it settled on the cracked earth just beyond the door. The village remained hushed, but life pulsed beneath the surface, hidden in the flutter of curtains, the slow creak of a cart wheeling past, the faint murmur of prayer rising from a distant shrine. You breathed in the mingled scents, earth, wood smoke, faint incense. For a moment, the weight on your shoulders lightened just enough for hope to flicker briefly behind your steady gaze. Your fingers found the coarse edge of another tile, this one freshly pressed, but as yet unbaked. The clay felt cool, stubbornly unyielding in your grip. A silent promise held fast beneath your palms. You nudged it slowly back onto the bench, then looked toward the wall where your tools hung, weathered yet steadfast companions in the endless dance of craft and survival. Outside, a faint murmur stirred, a ripple of voices, distant and indistinct, carried on a sudden gust that rattled the wooden beams overhead. The sound raised a pulse of unease beneath your calm, a quiet warning that the fragile piece balanced precariously on a knife's edge. Your heart followed the echo down the narrow alley, where copper lanterns swayed gently against the darkened sky. The presence you had sensed earlier rippled again, closer now, though still unseen, patient, watching. You tightened your grasp around the tiny shard of clay remaining on the bench, feeling its dust slip between your fingers like a fragment of your own past, fragile, cracked, but not yet beyond repair. And then, as the village held its breath beneath the gathering clouds, A distant voice whispered through the dusk, a name you thought buried long ago, carried by the wind with the weight of reckoning still to come. You stood by the doorway, a long moment, eyes tracing the trembling outlines of the village beneath the steel-gray sky. The cold seeped deep into your bones, threading through the thin fabric of your kimono, chilling your skin like the slow breath of regret wandering in. The mist, the thick silence pressed down. They seemed to hold their breaths, as if the village itself awaited an unseen reckoning. You felt the weight of those silent gazes in every shudder of the wind that slipped through the broken roof tiles above. The faint clatter of tiles shifting under the breeze startled you briefly, a subtle reminder of how precarious your crafted roofs truly were. Fragile shields against relentless storms and whispered suspicion alike. Your fingers wrapped tightly around the rough arch of the doorframe, the coarse grain biting into your palm, grounding you in the relentless present. The cold morning air was laced with the ever-faint scent of smoldering ash, cutting through the damp earth's mustiness like a distant memory you could almost touch but never quite hold. Your gaze drifted to the cracked street winding away, swallowed slowly by the mist. Shadows pooled in the narrow alleys. Secrets lingered beneath the heavy eaves. Somewhere beyond the hush, a faint murmur rose, low, urgent, threading through the buildings like a restless psalm. It tugged at the corner of your consciousness, a pulse beneath the quiet. You stepped back inside, the door shutting softly behind you with a distant finality. The workshop was thick with the scent of dust, clay, and fading smoke. Your fingers found the familiar edges of shards scattered across the worn bench, each piece fractured like your own resolve, broken, yet holding shape in the slow dance of making whole again. You traced a cracked tile slowly, pressing your fingertips against its cold surface, feeling the subtle imperfection beneath your skin, the impermanence etched into everything you valued. A faint sound drew your attention, whispered footsteps, hesitant, measured. Your breath caught. You did not move, letting the quiet swell around you, thickening the air with unspoken anticipation. Shadows shifted deeper in the corner where the light failed, the stillness humming with expectation. The door creaked slightly, more a sigh than a sound, and a figure stepped through, by the dim glow of the lingering embers still glowing faintly in the kiln. He paused, eyes fixed on the scattered tiles, as if searching for answers in their fractures. The tension between you stretched taut, fragile, like the dried clay that might crumble under too much pressure. His breath was slow, controlled, blending with the distant ticking of the fading fire. You noticed the tight grip of his hand on the cracked wood of the workbench, knuckles white against worn grain. Without a word, you reached for a half-finished tile, its fresh clay cool and slightly sticky beneath your fingertips. You held it out slowly, the movement deliberate in its quiet gravity. His gaze flicked up, tracing the curve of the tile's edge, a flicker of something, hesitation, perhaps hope, passing through his troubled eyes. Outside, the wind curled sharply through a gap in the worn shutters. You smelled the faint bite of chill, mixed with the comforting scent of wet stone and moss. It wove into the room, stirring the faint ashes atop the oven's edge. A soft chime rose somewhere distant, carried on the breath of the breeze, like a fragile prayer slipping through cracked walls. You bent once more towards the kiln, fingertips hovering over the coals, now reduced to glowing embers. The embers' warmth was a pulse beneath your skin, a slow, steady heartbeat amid the silent cold that pressed relentlessly on every surface. You felt the weight of the fire's last breath, merging with your own steady rhythm, a quiet testament to endurance. Your companion's eyes followed your careful movements, no longer guarded but shadowed with a slow surrender to the shared understanding between you. The distance, though frail, seemed less insurmountable. Yet beneath that faint truce lay the deeper truths neither dared voice, the fractures that the slow turning of days had not yet mended. A sudden shift in the air pulled your attention back to the narrow window, where a single leaf drifted down like a mute witness to quiet endurance. It descended slowly, curling at the edges, fragile and weathered, carried by a breath that shivered through the village like a whispered challenge. The light around it was muted, the colors faded, but the grace of its fall held a gentle strength that echoed quietly against your own steady pulse. The soft murmur of voices rose faintly again outside, tangled within the restless stirring of the wind. You felt the sharp edge of a watchful gaze brush inexplicably across your back, a presence lingering at the borders of the quiet, patient and unseen. It was neither friend nor enemy, but a shadow waiting to catch the moment when resolve might falter. Your eyes locked briefly on the rough shards scattered below the bench, pieces brittle and uneven, sharp edges catching the faint light with cruel precision. Within those shards lay the fragmented past you tried to bury, the whispered shame, the silent accusations, a honor questioned by unrelenting time. The ember under your fingers dimmed further, the last tendrils of heat retreating like a fading heartbeat. Outside, the bell tolled again, low and heavy, sinking into the thick dusk. Its sound trembled through the village with a weight that twisted tight inside your chest. A summons or a warning, you could not tell. You rose slowly from the bench, the cool stone floor cold beneath your bare feet. Steady, but unyielding, the air seemed charged with the promise of something long held back, a ripple just beneath the still surface of morning's reluctant light. For a moment, you hesitated on the threshold, aware that eyes unseen were watching, waiting for the first crack to appear in your quiet resolve. The village held its breath with you, shadows tightening around the edges of sound. And then, from deep within the gloom behind a shutter half closed, a voice whispered a name you wished to forget. A name carried on the wind like a blade sliding softly into silence, waiting to be answered. You leaned closer to the narrow slit of the shutter, your breath fogging the cool, dim glass as the village beyond slumbered under its pallid sky. The name, whispered like a blade slipping through silk, lingered in your ears, a subtle vibration that trembled against the stillness of the morning. Your fingers curved against the worn wood of the window frame, the grain rough and indifferent beneath your skin, grounding you in the relentless now. The chill from outside seeped inward, weaving its fingers through the fading warmth left by the dying kiln embers. Shadows clung tight to the corners of your workshop, retreating reluctantly from the feeble dawn light. The air moved slowly, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine smoke, whispering secrets unlocked only by patience. You inhaled deeply, steadying the storm rising beneath your ribs. The weight of unspoken stories pressed against your chest like a stone, yet you held still, a silent anchor amidst the shifting whispers. Your eyes drifted down to the scattered shards at your feet, fragments of forgotten promises and cracked hopes. Each jagged edge caught the pale light, throwing a brief dance of muted reflections onto the worn floorboards. You knelt slowly, fingers brushing over the uneven surfaces, cool and brittle beneath your touch. The fragile remnants reminded you of the mornings spent shaping clay with slow insistence, coaxing strength from weakness, form from formlessness. Time moved differently here, stretched and thick, like the gray mist that clung to the village's every breath. A sudden gust rattled the shutters harshly, rattling loose a thin whisper of dry leaves that skittered across the floor, like restless ghosts. Your head snapped toward the door, eyes narrowing into the thickening dusk of your workshop. The footsteps had returned, heavier this time, measured but certain. They broke the fragile quiet with the dull tap of wood against stone, each step a pulse threading the tension tighter. You rose carefully, limbs slow to obey, stiffness reminding you of the hours etched into every muscle. The door eased open, without a creak, revealing a shape shrouded in shadow, the faint outline folding into the gloom like a tentative question. Your breath held, the room contracting around the quiet exchange. The visitor's eyes, flash of pale determination, found yours and lingered, weighing the centuries-old silence wrapped between you. No words passed, but the currents of history swirled thick and low, a shared gravity neither dared disturb hastily. Your hands, calloused and steady, reached toward the bench where a roughly shaped tile awaited the fire's forge. The clay felt cold, moist and earthy, a stubborn mass reluctant to yield. You lifted it, tracing its outline with slow reverence, as if the smooth curve held the answer to some long-buried censure. The visitor noticed the gesture, a flicker of something unspoken passing between your gazes, a fragile offering, a silent plea for trust amid debt and shadow. Outside, the wind shifted, drawing the faint scent of rain from the distant hills. The air thickened with the promise of storm, the sky suddenly heavy with the gray of undone weather. Flickering candlelight from neighboring windows cast wavering silhouettes, delicate and transient, against the shut shutters. The village seemed poised, held tight in a breath, caught between the decay of what was and the uncertainty of what might come. You guided the clay back onto the bench, fingers spreading dust lightly over its surface. Every grain was a detail, every imperfection telling a story of toil and endurance. The kiln's ember glow had long since faded, but the memory of heat smoldered just beneath your skin. A pulse, a heartbeat, a flicker of unyielding will. Your visitor stepped closer, the scrape of worn footwear on loose gravel sharp in the quiet, the scent of damp leather mingling faintly with smoke. The tension in his shoulders loosened marginally, shoulders slumping as the invisible walls between you thinned. If only for a breath, you caught the wet gleam of rain beginning to fall against the narrow window pane, each droplet carving slow, meandering trails down the glass. A long silence stretched, filled only by the distant roll of thunder, low and swelling, pressing like an omen against the stillness. You understood then that this visit was not mere happenstance, but a folding of threads tightened long ago, an opening of a chapter tightly bound by time and regret. Your gaze locked on the visitor's face, searching for a crack in the mask of careful solemnity. The weight of unspoken debts and fragile hopes pressed between you, palpable as the chill wrapping the room. There was no threat, but no relief either, only the slow unfolding of possibilities, balanced precariously on the edge of what could be. The rain quickened outside, pouring in soft sheets that pattered against the clay tiles you had crafted, each drop a dull hammer echoing across the roof's brittle surface. The village moaned under the weight of the storm's prelude, and you stood rooted in the fragile calm before the flood. As the visitor finally reached toward a cracked shard resting by your feet, fingers trembling slightly, a sudden sharp crack split the air, not from outside, but within the brittle walls of the workshop itself. The plaster near the ceiling crumbled, dust motes swirling in slow spirals that caught the faintest light. You both froze, breath caught, eyes drawn to the silent fracture, spreading like a wound. Outside, the bell tolled once more, deep, urgent, a summons threading through the clamor of the coming storm. You could feel it, the pulse beneath the quiet, the slow unwinding of secrets waiting patiently to surface. You turned back toward the window, catching the silhouette of a figure watching from the distance, still and unreadable beneath the shifting shadows, waiting for the moment the fragile balance would finally break. You watched the cracked plaster settle like a slow sigh beneath the weight of unseen forces, its dust drifting softly through the fading light. The visitor's gaze lingered a moment longer on the fractured wall before turning away, swallowed back into the shadows that pulled at the edges of your workshop like quiet claws. Outside, the rain's gentle rhythm pressed on the tiled roofs, each drop a fragile drumbeat against the brittle surface, a steady pulse that tied together the fractured moments hanging heavy around you. You remained still, fingers tracing the rough grain of the window frame beneath your palm. The cool wood fading light. The air carried the scent of wet pine and clay, the mingled odors drifting in through the narrow cracks with a slow insistence, filling the room with a whispered reminder of the life beyond these walls. The storm's breath was a quiet presence in the spaces between each heartbeat, patient, waiting. Your eyes fell upon the shards scattered across the floor, jagged fragments, catching faint pools of lamplight and casting fragmented reflections like broken memories held too lightly. Each piece told a fragment of a story you wore beneath your skin, fragile, imperfect, yet stubborn in its persistence. You knelt slowly, fingertips brushing the cold edges as if drawing strength from their stillness. The visitor had stepped back into the deepening dusk, footsteps swallowed by damp earth and the thickening mist. Retreating into the narrow alleys where shadows wove themselves into a thickening shroud. The village seemed to hold its breath, the tension gathering in the spaces between the silent houses and the muted rustling of leaves beneath the swollen trees. Somewhere distant, a low murmur stirred, the restless shifting of voices carried on the wind like secrets slipping from cracked lips. Your breath came slow and deliberate as you rose, the damp stone floor cold beneath your bare feet. The workshop, cloaked in the tenuous light of a dying candle, became a sanctuary, constricted by silence, but alive with the energy of unseen things. You moved toward the bench, hands finding the rough edge of a tile, still soft with moisture, the cool clay pressing gently back against your fingers like a patient echo. Outside, the storm's breath deepened, and the faint scurry of movement beneath the swollen sky stirred your senses, a fragile reminder that the world beyond your walls refused to be still for long. The sigh of the wind threaded its way through the eaves, lifting the scent of damp earth and old wood ash into the room. In its weave, you caught a faint trace of smoke, drifting from a lone chimney where flames fought against the growing chill. The moments stretched taut in the shrinking light. The fragile calm folded like delicate paper, edges curling toward shadows, filled with half-remembered rumors, and the soft weight of glances unnoticed. Your hands moved again over the tile, feeling every grain, every imperfection, a slow, methodical act that tethered you to the ground beneath rushing clouds. A subtle creak near the door stirred your pulse, the faintest invitation or warning carried in the sharp scrape of wood against stone. You stiffened, the muscles in your neck tightening as silence grew thick and palpable. But the door stayed closed, holding back secrets you could only guess at. The shadows beyond heavy with promise and unspoken threats. You turned back to the kiln's cold hearth, fingertips brushing over a patch of ash where embers had long since faded. The faintest heat seemed to linger beneath the surface, a slow warmth that resonated with the steady beat of your own pulse. This place, scarred and battered, held the promise of renewal, if only patience endured, if the slow turning of time could gather the fractured past and meld it whole once more. The village exhaled through the storm, a blend of soft footsteps and distant voices dissolving into the rhythm of rain against wood and stone. You felt the weight of those murmurs, both curious and cautious, folding around the tight spaces of history and hurt, wrapped in the brittle roofs you forged. In that quiet, you sensed the fragile threads pulling taut again. Your body ached from the long hours bent over clay and kiln. You stretched slow, every movement measured and deliberate, as if woken from a deep sleep. Your hands lingered on the smooth curve of an unbaked tile, its surface cool and supple, waiting to be shaped by time and fire. The clay's stubborn resistance was a familiar weight, a burden and a beacon in the heavy dusk. Outside, a sudden gust rattled the shires, sending a scattering of dry leaves swirling through the narrowing crack beneath the door. The sharp rustle in the dim silence cut through the thickening tension, stirring the dust motes and shadows alike. Every small sound seemed magnified beneath the gathering storm, ringing with the promise of change. A low tolling arose once again, the bell's deep voice, folding into the night air like a slow, urgent summons. It rolled through the village and settled into your bones, a vibration threading through the stillness that echoed with unresolved reckoning. You stood motionless, listening as each chime sank into the wet earth, carried beneath the heavy clouds that swallowed the sky. The door behind you shuddered slightly, as if breathed upon by unseen hands. You turned slowly, senses sharpening to the faintest stir in the edges of the room, the subtle shifting that meant the balance was tipping. Beyond the faint glow of your candle, a shadow gathered, patient and unreadable. Your breath caught, steady but charged. The moment held, fragile as cracked clay, raw as the soil, waiting beneath waiting seeds. And then, barely a whisper beyond the threshold, a name was spoken again, soft and urgent, threading through the silence like a blade. Sheathed in shadow, a calling that could no longer be ignored. You stood by the doorway as the last flickers of ember heat slipped into memory, the faint ash dust drifting lazily through the still air. The rain outside had softened into a mist that clung to the crooked tiles overhead, turning each one into a muted patchwork under the iron-gray dawn. Your breath fogged the narrow window pane, tracing slow spirals that dissolved almost as soon as they appeared into the cold morning light. The floor beneath your feet was cold stone, slick with remnants of rain and scattered clay dust. The weight of the night's tension lingered in the air, thick and slow, settling like wet wool upon your shoulders. Around you, the shards rested quietly on the worn floorboards, fragile and fractured, their edges softened by time, but sharp enough to mark the passing of broken days. You lowered your gaze to them again, fingertips brushing a jagged curve, as if seeking a story beyond the cracks. The visitor's silhouette had vanished into the mist-swathed alleys, but the echo of his hesitant footsteps pressed on your mind with a slow insistence. Suspicion and hope tangled like creeping vines beneath your skin, twisting with the heavy scent of damp earth and fading incense. Somewhere beyond the quiet walls, the village murmured its secrets, doors closing softly, muted voices carried on the still breeze, the distant clatter of wood against stone as life stirred beneath the storm's retreat. You moved back toward the bench, each step measured and deliberate. Your hands rested over an unbaked tile, its surface slick with cool clay, reluctant to yield beneath your careful touch. The faint moisture clung to your fingers, the stubbornness in its weight, a steady reminder. The slow pressure exerted now would ripple through time, shaping form as surely as the kiln's unseen fire. Every line pressed into the clay was an echo of today, fragile yet determined, like breath caught between silence and the waiting dawn. From beyond the half-open door came the first murmurs of the waking village, soft footfalls, light as feathers on stone, the low rustling of linen against wood, the subtle cadence of life reasserting itself beneath heavy clouds. The scent of damp moss and old ash floated in, mingling with the crisp, pinched taste of morning air. You inhaled deeply, the coolness filling your lungs with a sharp clarity, an almost piercing edge among the muted grays and browns around you. The kiln, now cold but never truly silent, held its promise in the dull residue of ash and cracked brick. You knelt to gather a handful of the soft powder, letting it sift slowly between calloused fingers. The dust settled over your palms like a delicate shroud, falling back to the floor in a slow, ghostly dance. It was a burnt memory, a fragment of long hours and warmer flames, a trace you carried with you, like the faint heat of regret caught beneath your skin. Outside, the sky shifted imperceptibly, a subtle rippling of light caught between shadow and rain-thickened fog. A sudden gust swept through the alleys, whistling soft and low, threading between broken shutter and bowed beam, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and wet stone. The chill ran through your sleeves, creeping upward like a silent watcher, threading its fingers along the nape of your neck. You shivered, steadying yourself with slow breaths, eyes narrowing against the gray wash of morning. A low toll from the village bell sounded, deep, resonant, and slow, reaching into the depths of the waking world like a weighted call. It pressed against your chest, each strike a measured beat echoing through narrow streets and shuttered doorways. The sound carried with it the unspoken heaviness of promises yet to be fulfilled, secrets folded tight beneath the dull sky. Your fingers trailed over the rough edge of a tile laid out on the bench. The clay felt cool and hardening. A stubborn resistance met, but not surrendered to. You turned it slowly, catching the subtle imperfections, the minute cracks that time had traced like slow rivers across its surface. Each detail whispered of labor and patience, the long hours shaped not just by hand, but by the steady gathering of will beneath the weight of silent scrutiny. The faintest creak startled you, the shifting of stone or wood, too deliberate to be ignored. Your breath caught and smoothed, your gaze zeroing on the dim doorway where shadows pooled thick and unmoving. The faintest stir of presence, patient and unseen, pressed at the edges of your quiet refuge. Neither friend nor enemy, but some restless fragment threading through the village's slow pulse. You rose from the bench, limbs heavy with spent night and cautious resolve. The floor beneath your feet held the cold kiss of dawn. A steady anchor as you stepped toward the threshold, hand brushing the rough wood of the doorframe. The world outside waited, wrapped in mist, heavy with whispers. The village itself holding its breath alongside you. As your eyes adjusted to the low light, a slender figure emerged from the swirling gray at the edge of the street. There was a stillness in the posture, a careful way of moving that spoke of familiarity, hiding beneath watchfulness. The rain had dulled all color, washing away any distinctions, leaving shape and shadow alone to speak. Your gaze locked for a fleeting moment, a quiet exchange beneath the oppressive sky that bore down without mercy. Recognition, fear, and a flicker of silent understanding passed between you, as fragile and tentative as the leaf that twirled slowly from a shivering branch above. It spun down in slow circles, curling its edges as if reluctant to fall, settling softly on the cracked earth near your feet. The figure stepped closer, footsteps almost swallowed by the thickening mist. A breath of wet cloth, faint leather, and old smoke drifted faintly toward you, carried by the heavy air. The subtle weight of shared histories and unspoken debts pressed between you in the silence that followed. A quiet tension poised on the edge of brittle calm. Then, Above the village's muted breathing, a whisper broke free, a name, carried on the wind like a trembling thread, pulled taut across the coming storm. The syllables wound slowly through the damp air, brushing your skin like a slow shiver, a promise and warning intertwined. You met the shadow's gaze, the last tendrils of morning light slipping behind the shifting clouds, and felt the fragile stillness crack, a slow fracture growing beneath the weight of all that remained unspoken, waiting for a moment yet to come. You remained by the doorway long after the visitor's steps faded into the thickening mist, your breath steady but heavy in the chilled air. The rain had settled into a soft murmur, the steady patter against the molded clay tiles' uneven surfaces, drawing a rhythmic undercurrent beneath the village's quiet. It was a sound at once soothing and ominous, like the slow ticking of an unseen clock counting down to a moment yet to arrive. Your fingers lingered on the doorframe, the rough grain biting into your palm, grounding you against the swirling unease that pressed from the shadows beyond the walls. The workshop's dimness wrapped around you once more, the fading embers, long cold now, leaving only a memory of warmth, hovering like a fragile pulse beneath the cracked stones. You let your eyes drift over the scattered shards below, their jagged edges catching scarce light and casting fractured reflections that seemed to shimmer in the quiet. Each fragment told its own story, silent, yet bound by the same stubborn persistence that had driven your hands through countless hours of shaping and waiting. You knelt slowly, fingertips tracing the cool contours of a broken tile, the cold clay pressing like a whispered echo beneath your skin. The texture was rough but familiar, like the surface of a weathered path leading back through time, step by cautious step. The weight of countless unsaid words and old grievances hung thick in the air, as dense as the scent of damp earth that crept in through the cracked roof tiles with every hesitant gust of morning wind. Rising carefully, you moved toward the bench and reached out for the half-formed tile resting there, its surface still yielding under your touch. The cool clay resisted softly, a subtle reminder of the slow patience demanded by your craft. Each nudge and press was deliberate, a measured act of quiet will in a world that often offered only sharp edges and fleeting moments. The faint trace of moisture clung to your fingers, cool like a breeze passing through a mist-shrouded forest. Steady despite the trembling of your own pulse beneath it. Outside, the sky was a grim vault of steel gray, low and heavy, as if weighed by the breath of centuries. The rooftops stretched out before you in a patchwork of muted browns and dusty greens, each tile a fragile shield against the relentless rain that had only just softened. Somewhere distant, the faint murmur of villagers moving in muted steps threads through the alleys, their voices indistinct, whispers caught in the slow churn of fog, drifting between the wooden beams and ancient walls. You let your gaze narrow, picking out the slow dance of details, the curve of a sagging eave, the ripple of water droplets straining from a weather-beaten leaf, the rustle of moss beneath an unseen paw. The world beyond your shelter was alive yet fragile, woven from delicate balances, sustained only by the steady pulse of time and quiet endurance. The memory of the visitor's hesitant presence lingered like a shadow cast by the dwindling light, a thread of tension winding itself tight beneath the surface of every small sound. Turning back to the kiln, you rested your hands on the roughened brick, the coldness biting crisp against your skin, where once fire had ruled with creeping heat. The ash lingered faintly, a pale ghost dusting the hearth, scattered like forgotten promises long since burnt away. You brushed over the cracked surface with slow fingers, feeling the lingering warmth as if it were a heartbeat pulsing beneath the stillness. The fire was gone, but its echo remained, steady and patient, a quiet testament that destruction and creation were woven tightly in this endless cycle. In the low light, your eyes caught a faint movement at the threshold, the slow fall of a lone leaf, spiraling with a hesitant grace from a trembling branch above. It turned in lazy circles, edges frayed and curling inward like a whispered sigh, tracing a slow descent toward the cracked earth beneath your feet. The motion held a fragile strength, a quiet defiance amidst inevitable decay, mirrored in the slow set of your own shoulders as you stood rooted amidst the shifting shadows. The cold air carried with it a subtle change, a shift in the quiet that tightened around your senses like a thin cord. The temperature dipped further, breath slanting in quiet puffs, mingling with the mingled scents of clay dust, wet wood, and fading incense. A sudden scrape near the door sliced briefly through the stillness, sharp as a shard breaking free. Your breath caught lightly, heart tightening, as the shadows in the corners seemed to gather closer, the wood groaning softly beneath invisible. Wait, you turned slowly, eyes narrowing as a silhouette emerged from the haze beyond the glassed window, the shape barely distinct against the gray wash of morning's reluctant light. The figure stood motionless, patient and unreadable, a thin thread connecting the stranger's presence with the tangled knots of past deeds and half-forgotten promises. Rain traced lazy rivers down the windowpane, each droplet marking time with a soft, steady rhythm that matched the slow pulse hammering beneath your ribs. The silence stretched taut between you, a fragile thread held between two wary souls, suspended in a moment heavy with unspoken reckoning. Your fingers curled unconsciously around the edge of a tile on the bench, the rough surface grounding you as your gaze locked with the distant figure outside. The world beyond the glass was shrouded still in uncertainty, waiting with bated breath for what might slip through the cracks of dawn's fading shadows. Then the bell tolled once more, deep and resonant, its solemn call rapping through the village alleys like a slow, warning breath. The sound sank into your bones, folding around the quiet like a promise unspoken, stirring the brittle dust of history beneath the fragile calm. Your eyes flicked back to the visitor, whose posture shifted slightly in response, a subtle gesture lost in the mist but charged with meaning. As the last chime faded into the thickening air, you sensed the fragile balance shifting, sliding beneath the weight of all that had been and all that waited still. The shadows ticked forward with patient inevitability, threading silence with a thin, gleaming edge. And then, from somewhere just beyond the veil, a whispered name slipped through the cold air, soft, urgent, nearly lost. It twisted like a sharpened blade through the fog, threading a slow tremor that shivered over your skin and settled deep within. You held your breath, heart pounding against the quiet walls of your chest, as the world waited, silent and watching, for the moment the fragile stillness would break. You stood there for a moment longer, the soft weight of damp air settling on your skin as the village quieted into a fragile lull. The rain had tempered into a gentle mist that kissed the cracked tiles above, a whisper of cleansing, of time folding itself into something softer. Your eyes drifted slowly over the worn wooden table, scattered with the broken remnants of labor. The shards of clay, jagged yet tender in their testimony. They were no longer just fragments, but markers of a struggle finally meeting its close. The shadows in the corners of the workshop softened, dissolving into the pale light threading through the latticed window. Your fingers brushed methodically over the cool surface of the unbaked tile resting on the bench, its stubborn earthiness grounding you as it had all those countless days before. It was more than clay now. It was a quiet promise, one forged from patience, mistakes, and the slow forging of honor from the ashes of doubt. Outside, the village began to ease from its hold. Doors creaked open with gentle sighs, and the distant murmur of footsteps mingled with the soft hum of awakening life. A breeze stirred the hanging moss, lifting tendrils of wet wood smoke that carried a faded sweetness, like memory, fleeting but not lost. You drew in the scent deeply, a balm to the aching coil that had gripped your chest far too long. The visitor's shadow was gone, dissolved back into the misted alleys, but the weight of his presence lingered in the quiet folds of the room, like a breath held and finally released. Between you, in that unspoken space, the tension that had bound years and words unspoken loosened, unraveling into the gentle acceptance of things that must be faced and, in time, healed. A soft sound caught your attention, the slow drip of a raindrop falling from the eaves onto the clay tile below. The delicate patter echoed through the stillness as natural and steady as your own pulse, spreading warmth behind your ribs. You knelt briefly, gathering a handful of the softened ash on the cold hearth, letting it sift through your fingers like the passing of seasons. In its dust lay the slow cycle of destruction and renewal, the eternal dance of fire and earth that shaped not only your craft, but the very essence of life. You rose with a careful breath, the stiffness in your joints easing in quiet surrender to the morning light. The sky above was shifting, pale stripes of blue bleeding softly against the retreating gray, a tentative promise cradled by the slow dawn. A solitary leaf twirled lazily from a distant branch, caught in an unseen current, its edges curled but assured as it traced an effortless descent to rest among the stones below. That leaf, fragile and resilient, seemed to mirror the beating rhythm inside you, the slow reclaiming of hope and wholeness beneath all the cracks and shadows. You knew this quiet balance was hard-won, a fragile truce stitched from the threads of persistence and whispered forgiveness. Turning back to your workbench, your hands found the worn tools resting patiently against the wall, their once sharp blades dulled by seasons, but steady as ever. They bore the silent weight of countless days shaping stubborn clay, just as you had borne the weight of doubt and whispered accusation. Now, in this soft moment unfolding, they seemed to hum with steady resolve. There was still craft to be made, still beauty to coax from earth, and a life to rebuild, tile by tile. Outside, the bell sounded once more, low and sonorous, threading its way through the village like a final note sealing a song. Its steady toll touched the damp air quietly, folding over rooftops and narrow lanes, a gentle marker of time passing and the stories it holds. Unlike before, it carried no edge of warning, only the comfort of continuity. You stepped to the door, the cold wood firm beneath your palm, and gazed outward at the village, awakening beneath that pale, forgiving sky. The crisp air filled your lungs, steady and clear, and for a moment, the weight that had pressed so relentlessly began to lift. The houses, the tiles you had, forged with your own hands, the narrow alleys threaded with whispers, all of it felt less heavy, as if finally breathing out alongside you. The visitor's name whispered once again through the breeze, faint but steady now, like a note of remembrance that no longer stings, but lingers in the cool air as a quiet truth. The unseen watcher at the edges of your life had not disappeared, but neither did it hold a threat it once carried. Instead, it blended into the shifting patterns of wind and rain, the background hum of a world that turns, slow and steady, beyond pain and shadow. You let your fingers trail one last time over the rough tile's edge, feeling the smooth imperfections as a map of days endured. The promise held within its clay was yours to carry forward, not as burden, but as strength, tempered by fire and time. You settled your hands in your lap, the ache in your limbs folding into a gentle calm. Around you, the village finally exhaled, a breath deep and rolling, like soft waves caressing a long-forgotten shore. The rain began to ease, the clouds parting in slow grace to reveal stretches of awakening light, spilling over the earth's worn canvas. As your eyelids grew heavy, the sound of the quiet world beneath the soft roofs lulled you toward the peace that had long felt distant. The slow ebb of the day's first warmth touched your skin, folding gently over the worn wood and stubborn clay, carrying with it the tender weight of endings and the subtle glow of beginnings. And there, in that fragile half-light, beneath rooftops you had crafted with patient hands, you found the stillness you had sought, the calm pulse of a life rebuilt, ready to rest at last.